Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask you to enlighten us, to help us to know you more deeply, and in knowing you to fall in love more profoundly. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. So a couple notes. First, I have to respond to a thesis that was posted on my door. So Nick posted Nick's one thesis instead of his 95 theses. And his one thesis is that the Holy Spirit is fully dove. Contrary to what I taught last class, in which we said that the visible mission of the Holy Spirit was not a full incarnation in the form of a dove, but rather just the appearance of a dove. So I sent a picture of that thesis to the author of this book, Father Thomas Joseph White, and he sent back, I thought he was going to send back, angry face emoji or, heretic, you should stomp it out. But instead he said, I wrote a bluegrass song which had words to the similar effect, and said that you had to serve the bird and love the dove. And so I think that's going to be going to be on the sticker that I'm making for this class. So anyway, he thought it was pretty funny, even though it's not true, obviously. Okay, the second thing is we're coming to a transition point kind of in the class. We only have a couple more classes left after this, and then will be the final take-home project, which is if you would like to write a one-page reflection on one insight that you gained about God and how that's affected your spiritual life. So one insight that you gained about God and how that's affected your spiritual life. Please do not use papyrus font. I will burn the paper instead of read it. I'm serious. And you will not get credit.
Comic Sans?
Comic Sans. MLA citation is crap. You want to use Chicago style because it's footnotes, and footnotes are way better than in-text citation. But I know you guys all use APA and MLA, which is just insane. Like, I can't understand a civilized university requiring that. But regardless, they're all based on typewriters. That's why they do those. It's a transition point in the class because we've kind of come to the end of considering God in and of himself. So when we look at the Summa, the structure of the Summa, it starts, so this is not original to me, but this is kind of a standard kind of reading of how St. Thomas structured the Summa. He wrote it in sections over a period of time, and it starts with the first part, which is what this class is on. Usually that's written like this for prima pars, the first part. The first part starts with thinking of God in and of himself and understanding God in and of himself. And that's what we've been talking about a lot over the last couple months. But then it kind of comes out into creation. And we start considering God in his creatures, how we understand creation, who he has made, including the angels and ourselves. And then it comes to our actions, or moral theology. And this is what the context of the next semester's class is going to be. This is the second part of the Summa is divided into two smaller parts. So we call them the Prima Secunda and the Secunda. No, sorry, in Secundae. Sorry, Prima Secunda and Secunda. And so we're going to try talk about that starting next semester, about how we've come from God. And now we start talking about how ought we to live. And then, how ought we to live points us back towards him, because God is our source, but he's also our end, as we've talked about. And the way we come back to God is not only through our moral actions, but also through Jesus Christ and the sacraments. And that's the context of the third part of the Summa, the Tertia Parts. We call this scheme broadly the scheme of exitus and reditus. Which basically just means going out and coming back. All things come from God, and all things return to God. God is our source and our end. God is our beginning and our conclusion. He is the Alpha and the Omega, as Jesus says. And so this is broadly the pattern that we're following for all these classes. I'm basically doing a semester, a book in the Summa. So we're in the prima pars. We have completed the section on considering God in and of himself. And now we're going to start thinking about creation. And as we do that, we're going to think first about creation itself. Then we're going to talk about the highest level of creation, which are the angels. Then we're going to talk about us as spiritual beings, especially our body and our soul and how those go together. And then that will transition us to next semester when we start talking about our actions. So that's the plan. So today's class, we're going to basically talk about creation itself. And St. Thomas makes this transition in a really beautiful way. He says, we've just been talking about the Trinity. And the Trinity is primarily about processions in God, right? We talked about this, right? Internal, spiritual processions which remain in God. And we use the analogy of the psychological analogy of thought and love as internal processions that remain within us. Now he's saying, okay, those are internal processions which perfectly reflect God, right? Like the Word of God is a perfect reflection of God himself, so much so that he possesses the same divine nature. And the love of God is a perfect reflection of God himself, so much so that it possesses the same divine nature, and it's one God in three persons. But now we're talking about other ways of processions. Those were perfect, internal, spiritual. Now we are talking about processions which are imperfect, external, and sometimes spiritual, sometimes material. And yet they are there to serve the same purpose, which is to reflect God in some way. It's just anything that's created is going to, by its nature, be imperfect in reflecting God, because God is infinite and transcendent and all good and all knowing. So, in order to do this, we have to use a couple philosophical tools that we haven't gone over yet. And the philosophical tool that we're going to use today are the four causes of Aristotle. This is how St. Thomas addresses creation as well. He starts with the four causes. Does anyone know what the four causes are? Has heard of the four causes before? Patrick? Josie? You've heard of them?
And I knew them at one point.
Josie, do you know them?
Same situation.
Okay. The four causes are, it's basically four different lenses by which we look at things that happen in the world, or things that are in the world. They are the efficient, material, the formal, and the final. The efficient cause, the material cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. So let's use an example. That action. I almost hit Elise in the face. That wasn't intentional. My intention was hit Mark in the face, and I missed. Okay, the efficient cause is the thing that causes something to happen. So like, in that case, the efficient cause is me throwing that marker. I am the efficient cause of that marker's flight through the world towards Mark. The material cause is the marker itself. It's what makes up the thing. So you can think about a table. The material cause of the table is the wood of the table. The efficient cause of the table is whoever made that table, whether it was a machine or a man, whatever. The formal cause is the thing that gives its form. We talked about form and matter already. We already know what a form is, right? It's the whatness of a thing. In this case, since it's a simple action, it's just the very activity of the thing flying through the air. The final cause is the end for which something is made. The end of this table is multifaceted, but primarily it's to be used to hold things on top of. Its final cause is not to be a bed, although it could be used in that circumstance if we wanted to, but it wouldn't be a good bed. The final cause of me throwing the marker was also twofold. One, it got out some pent-up aggression I've been feeling towards Mark, and 2, it was a good demonstration for the class. So these are the 4 causes, and we can apply them to basically anything that we talk about. So let's apply them to creation, and that's what we're going to do. When we talk about creation, the first thing is that we think about is efficient cause. We think about something being created, and oftentimes we think of the image that we find in the Bible of God as a workman, as a craftsman, as someone sculpting us out of clay and making things to happen. But if we just talk about the efficient cause, we miss the fullness of things. If we just talk about efficient causes or material causes, what things are made up of, we miss a lot more of understanding about what creation is. And before I kind of like delve into our view of things, I think it's useful for us to look at the more materialist or empiricist view of how things are made, like why people don't believe in God. But it's not necessarily even people who don't believe in God. It's just a particular way of looking at how people see the creation of the universe. So this is really important because this is like usually the number one thing that people say, well, you know, maybe did the world have to be made in 7 days? Is the world really young? Is which is wrong? Is it like, did God how do we account for evolution versus creation? And like that debate seems to be the proxy for understanding things. And we as Catholics have a much deeper and richer understanding of this that accounts for all the kind of scientific knowledge we have about the world in a beautiful way. And those kind of arguments are basically arguing about something that, like, we're over here saying, like, what the heck is going on here? Both the people who are religious in those arguments and the people who are scientists have it totally wrong and are based in a wrong structure. And so what we're going to do, before we talk about St. Thomas's understanding of things, is just understand where that debate comes from, because it's important. And it helps us to understand the relationship between faith and reason. So, first, I'm not going to do that. What is the materialist view of creation, right? Like, this is all the product of random chance. Those chances, because there are basically an infinite number of universes in the multiverse, including one where Doctor Strange has a ponytail. Like, there's an infinite number of chances that things could happen, and this just happens to be the situation in which things happen. And we discover that our universe is massive, and so there's a huge, basically an infinite number of planets upon which life could develop, and there's a pretty good chance that if the right circumstances are there, then things will develop, and therefore, we have what we have today. This is the monkeys typing on a typewriter argument about creation. If enough monkeys are typing on enough typewriters, then Shakespeare will come out of one of those typewriters. Like, you just increase the number of monkeys and typewriters, and eventually Shakespeare will come. Even though it's totally random, it's monkeys. Enough times it will just be the exact right random combination that brings something beautiful. Now you can see with that argument, like that analogy, it falls flat, because if I were to go into a room full of monkeys typing on typewriters and find like a draft of Hamlet, I would not think, oh man, what are the odds of that happening? I would think, oh, one of these monkeys is super intelligent and probably is going to take over the world, we see design in things, and that design reflects a designer. Now, despite all that, that argument is attractive to people. Because it's attractive because it purposely limits God and our understanding of things. If things are impersonal forces, then there isn't any God involved. If there's no God involved, then I don't have any limits on myself or on what I can do or what other things can do. Plus, it's attractive because it bears fruit. A materialistic, empiricist, scientific method does bear fruit. It bears fruit in technology, it bears fruit in like, you have iPhones now, and part of those iPhones came about because of this particular way of looking at the world. And that, a technological person would say, see all the progress we've made, therefore this must be the way of looking at the world. Now, what we have to do if we're going to address that is we have to look at the beginnings of that thought. What are the beginnings of it? It's not enough just to say, see, I did a good job here, therefore, like all this technology, therefore this is the way you should look at the world. We have to look at their fundamental assumptions. And it comes from a place, and this is where I'm going off into my particular rant about René Descartes. So just like be aware of it. It comes from a place of bad philosophy. When you say that only science is a materialistic way of looking at the world, is the only way of looking at the world, when you make that assumption, you're not saying that based off of a scientific method. You can't. It's recursive. It prevents you from actually saying, you can't come to the conclusion that science is the only way of looking at the world in a scientific manner. At some point you're doing philosophy, and you're basing it on certain assumptions. And the assumptions are that knowledge equals power, and so therefore if I have power, then that means it's correct knowledge. The assumptions are that impersonal or not, so is that immaterial or spiritual things can't possibly exist, therefore I should only look at material things. You base that assumption on several other things. And fundamentally it comes back to this guy, René Descartes. So Descartes, I'm just going to tell the story. So Descartes studied at the schools. He was a smart guy. He loved math. You guys all know that from your math classes. The Cartesian coordinate systems is named after Descartes. And Descartes was really upset at the philosophy at his time. He was kind of steeped in this philosophical school called nominalism, and there were all these just dead ends in philosophy, and he's like, I just got to clear this all out. He envisioned it like a German. He came to this conclusion while he was a soldier in the 30 Years' War. It was winter time, he was in winter quarters, he had nothing to do, so he drank wine and he stared at his candle and reflected on things. And he thought, I've been walking through all these tiny little German towns, and what these German towns need is some, French rationalization to them. They need straight streets that meet at right angles instead of these little warrens of towns that just grew up organically. And he thought, you know what? Philosophy needs the same thing. Philosophy is a mess. I should just bulldoze the entire thing and make straight lines and straight streets that come at right angles and periodically. I need to impose a grid system on philosophy. And so as he's thinking about this, he thinks, well, what's the stuff in philosophy I would want to save? He says, well, the one thing that I really like is math. Math makes sense. You don't need someone to trust, you don't have to trust someone to say 2 + 2 = 4. It's clear and concise and perfectly adhering to. You know it's true without any shade of a doubt in your mind. He says, okay, that's what I want. That's my goal. That's the kind of knowledge I want. That's the kind of knowledge that makes me happy. I can do a lot of stuff with math. I can, make my coordinate system, and I can graph things, and I can, do algebra, and I can do these things, and it makes clear sense. And based on these fundamental truths of math, I can come to all these other fundamental truths. So he says, why can't I just do that with philosophy? Why can't I say, I'm going to search for clear and concise ideas that I can wrap my mind around that are as clear as mathematical truths and base all philosophy off of that? So he's like, okay, what do I do? What's a clear and concise idea I can start with? Well, first off, as I stare kind of drunkenly at this candle, do I really have a clear and concise idea of the existence of this world around me? It's like, no, I don't actually, because it could be the product of an evil demon, or, he wasn't quite there yet, but I could be just a body in the matrix that's being used as a battery by, robots in the future. Or, I could just be totally, high on my own supply, and none of this could be real. And so I don't have a clear, concise idea of that, so therefore I can't start with reality around me. I have to look someplace else for a clear and concise idea. It's like, I don't understand, God is not a clear and concise idea. He seems to be pretty vague to me. So are the ideas of love and truth and all these other different things. What's the one thing that I am certain of with mathematical certainty? And the answer, of course, is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. The one thing he is certain of is that he is a thinking thing. He might be thinking things that are totally wrong and random. It might be deceived by some evil genie, but at least he knows for certain that he is a thinking thing. And so he says, I'm going to base all philosophy on that clear and concise idea. And when he starts to do that, he gets into a bit of a rut. He can't quite get out of his head. He can't quite come to understand the world around him. And so he does, like, he has this kind of like gap where he says, okay, I can believe in God, I can reason to God from my knowledge of myself, but then beyond that, God is the one who guarantees that all the things I see are true. But his disciples very quickly started to doubt whether we had bodies at all, whether we were all just minds in the matrix. And so much so that there's this famous story, and we don't have to get into it too much, but one of his great disciples, Malebranche, was trying to fight off this idea, and then a guy following him, this guy Berkeley, shows up at his, Berkeley comes to the conclusion that we just basically are just ideas. We don't have any conception of the material world around us. And he goes to Malebranche's house when Malebranche is old and tells him, like, this is what he's thinking, that Malebranche dies like the next day out of shock, and like he saw where he had fallen. And basically what happened in philosophy is we started doubting and we couldn't get out of the doubt. We started doubting and we couldn't get out of it. And we still haven't gotten out of it as a society. After the Cartesians tried and failed to get out of their radical doubt and tried to look for things that were clear and concise and couldn't make their way out of it, then every once in a while someone comes in and says, you just can't do it, nothing's true. So David Hume comes along and says, basically we can't know anything, we can't know any causality, we can't know anything at all. And so then this guy in Germany who's very punctual and very precise, a guy named Immanuel Kant, who people used to say you could time your day off of when he took his daily walk, and it was precisely the same amount of time, and he was a very orderly guy. He reads this guy David Hume, he's like, oh shoot, we got to figure this out. And so he comes up with some elaborate system of knowledge, but it's still based on the same fundamental flaws, and he fails. Even though he fails spectacularly, he fails big time. And we get to the point where we are today, where people don't feel like they can believe anything to be true, because nothing lives up to the standard of the clear and concise ideas of mathematics. And so people just throw out any kind of philosophy whatsoever and say, all I want is clear and concise ideas, and so the only thing that's going to work is empirical, material way of looking at the world. That's it. G.K. Chesterton, in his biography of St. Thomas Aquinas, says, he's talking about this, and it's really beautiful. He says, the melancholy Danish prince asks the question, I think, therefore I am, to which the rotund Italian Dominican replies, oh, no, sorry, so not I think that, so the melancholy Danish prince says, to be or not to be, that is the question. To which the rotund Dominican friar responds, to be, that is the answer. The problem with all these things is the doubt itself, that only knowledge can only be clear and concise ideas like mathematics. No one operates that way in the world. No one operates no one has reasoned to all the things of your life, that you are. You don't spend every day trying to discern whether you exist or not, or your body exists or not, based on clear and concise ideas. No one does that. Descartes was really, really arrogant in kind of what he was trying to do. So much so that he said, okay, I can come up with all knowledge from this method. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to apply this to medicine first, so that way I can live a longer time, because I'm clearly going to reason to a place where I fix medicine in a perfect way. And then, since I've lived longer, then I'll solve all the other problems with my extra time that I'm using for myself, which is like a really kind of bold strategy to pursue, but it failed. He lived a normal life. But all this starts with this flawed premise, that the only thing you can know are things like math, or we might say the follow-on one, material things. But what you see is, this is based on an assumption. Everything is based on an assumption. Everything starts with your first premises. And if your first premise goes off the rails someplace, everything that follows, even if it's good stuff, is going to be broken in some way. And we see that today in our world, right? The only thing that you can trust to be true, to be objectively true, what is it? It's your feelings. The one thing that's evidently apparent to you. The only place anyone finds truth is how I feel in any given moment. There is no objective truth outside of you, because you doubt fundamentally, because we're all moderns, even though we don't realize it, you fundamentally doubt that anything even exists outside of you. even though you walk through the streets each day. You can't really have any objective outside standards because I'm not even sure the outside world exists. So that's the mess we find ourselves in. And that's why a materialist philosophy of creation is attractive, because it's something that is clear. It's something that seems to bear fruit because, I've got an iPhone, and they didn't have an iPhone back in the Stone Age, therefore this might much be the right path. But at its basic level, at its basic premises, it fails. And the failure of the materialist view is that there is no formal or final causality. There's only efficient material causality. The only thing that matters is those things. Now, when we apply this understanding to creation, you see the debate between the creationists and the evolutionists, right? The evolutionists are saying that there is no room for God here. Because if there were a room for God, it would be in a material, efficient way. If God were creating man, there have to be some hole in the chain of evolution in which God acted in a particular way, in which God changed something materially. And we don't see any. Everything seems to follow through natural causes. Therefore, God couldn't exist, or God couldn't be active in this. The creationist says, no, there are holes. There are holes, but they're engaging on the same level, the efficient and material level. They say there is a place where, this skull looks a little different than this skull, and therefore God must have acted there. Or, the world actually is only 6,000 years old, and you weren't there to see it, but evolution's just bunk in general. And that's not scientifically true either. And so they're engaging on the same level of debate without considering the other aspects of causality that would lead towards understanding creation. And there's a certain kind of fear that you feel that when you're engaging on that level, you think, oh, I hope science doesn't disprove God. I hope science doesn't disprove God. Now think about how we've been talking about God this whole time and how we've described God. Could science ever disprove God? No. In our understanding of God, God transcends being itself. God is being himself. Everything that is because he makes it to be. And if that's the case, then even if there's all the natural processes in the world, all those natural processes are held in being by God. And so when we look at creation, let's first look at efficient causality. It's not so much that God shapes things, although he does in his own way. That's not the issue. The efficient causality, and it's kind of material causality too, is the gift of being. That's what's most important about creation. Not that at one point, because sometimes you can look at it this way, right? Okay, God created Adam and Eve, and then this big chain of effects followed after that, right? He pushed the first domino down, and then all the rest of the dominoes followed. But that's not the case. Everything that is, every single one of those dominoes exists because he gives it the gift of being. Creation is not so much about material efficient causality, but about spiritual efficient causality, that he is giving you actively the gift of your own existence. Because God is being itself, and you have being insofar as you participate in his being. He has given you the gift of being. And so creation is not just one moment where God said, let there be light. God is constantly saying at every second of the day, let there be Patrick, or let there be Dora Marie, or let there be Nick. At every second of the day, he's saying that. Inexplicably, I know, but he's saying it constantly. You are receiving the gift of being from the beginning and eternally. And so there's no it's almost like they're dealing on this superficial level when they have this debate, and we're talking underneath it the whole time. God is giving us this gift of being. Then we look at formal and final causality. Now, scientists have this weird way of speaking about creation as if they believed in formal and final causality, but then they have to say, oh, no, but it's just, there's no form, and there's no end. It's all chance. So they say, the Venus flytrap is perfectly evolved in order to do this. Even though, that's speaking of a formal cause and a final cause. The form of the Venus flytrap, which is evolved for these things, and the final cause, it's evolved to eat the fly that lands on it. But then they say, oh, but there is no final causality. So it's not, it's just a random process that happened to result in this thing, like a natural selection. This was more efficient at consuming nutrients, and therefore it's what it, yeah, sure. That doesn't mean that there isn't a form and a final cause. We are given the gift of our own forms, right? Our souls, the forms that make us are our souls, and that is given to us by God. Anytime there is a form, there has to be an exemplar. If you look at, like, again, let's go back to the monkeys and the typewriter example. If you came out of the room and there was a typed manuscript of Hamlet, you would immediately think, who is the genius who wrote this? Like, where did that come from? Where's the initial, part that came from? Where'd this develop? You wouldn't say, oh, this is really a random shot. And the reason is because form speaks of someone who causes it. If you see a beautiful painting, you don't think, oh, what a random splash of color that is. You see the form of it, that there's an actual, like, thing that's there that's unique and created, and then you think, who made that? And so for the formal cause, the forms are all in the mind of God, that we in some way reflect the ideas of God, and that's what gives us our form. And then the final cause. All things are made for a purpose, and that purpose is the glory of God. And this is the big question, why did God create anything at all? When he's perfect interiorly, for all time. And, the most perfect thing, if you've made the most perfect thing, why would you make an imperfect thing? If I made the most perfect ice cream sandwich, why would I then go make imperfect ice cream sandwiches? And the answer is, one, it's what God willed, so we just can't, he wanted to do this. It's like not some esoteric force that just happened to spill over. It was God's willed action. But two, each imperfect thing in some way reflects back God's glory. So it's not enough for God to just make perfect angels all in a row. They're imperfect in some way because they're limited, and they reflect some aspect of God's glory, but not the fullness of it. Even the rock or the slug or, sulfur or whatever reflects in some way God's glory because it shares in his created act. And so that final causality reflects that the end towards which we're all ordered. Now, in all this, we return to one other type of causality, and I'm going to, this is important, and it's really important for basically everything in the faith is, and I've talked about it already before, but I'm going to do it again, and that is secondary causality. We've also talked about this before, but it's secondary causality, or we would use the word instrumental causality. That God can work in and through his creatures. Since he is the first cause, the second causes are his creatures. And he can work in and through his second causes. Just like a general works through his staff, or the conductor of an orchestra works through his instruments, his artists, or as a viola player works through his viola. Those things enable and don't prevent us from knowing God. And so when it comes to creation and natural causes, we can totally believe in all the theory of evolution. Up until the point where we say this is the only thing that we think about when it comes to creation. When you make the jump from we can explain how this happens through a natural process very well to a high degree of accuracy, therefore this is the only thing in play or a factor, then the therefore jump is where we have to get off the train. And Darwinism is that idea that, okay, there is no other guiding force in the universe except for random chance and natural selection. Which random chance and natural selection are part of things, but it's not, we wouldn't say it's random, but we would say, the processes through which species evolve play a role, but we would say it's not random and it's not chance. It's part of a process. God works in and through natural processes to bring about his creation. So you can totally believe in evolution. You can totally believe in creation. And you can hold both of those things together. It doesn't have to be one or another. Many of the problems our Protestant brothers and sisters have is they don't believe in secondary causality. They believe it has to be God or it has to be natural, and it can't be both. And if it's both, then it's got to be 50-50 or something like that. With secondary causality, it's 100% the first cause, working 100% through the second cause, in order for things to happen. Any questions? I'll stop there for a second. Yeah.
Can you just reiterate the difference between efficient and material?
Efficient cause is the artist. The material cause is the matter the artist uses. So for a sculptor, the efficient cause is Michelangelo sculpting, and the matter is the marble that he uses to make his thing. And then the formal cause in that case would be the shape or the form of the sculpture. And the final cause would be for beauty or glorification God or whatever. So,
So do angels not have a material cause?
yes. Yes and no. For angels, and we'll talk about this next time, I think, but for angels, their principle of, their material cause still is kind of the gift of being, even though it's not matter per se. But the fact that they're given the gift of being means that they have something that they receive that creates them, even though they're purely immaterial. We'll talk about angels next time.
So would you say like the fundamental flaw is that we're taking a model or a way of looking at the world and assuming that's the only way to
Exactly.
look at the world?
Yeah, you could take the example of you're standing in a field, it's dark, and you put on night vision goggles. And you could say, that's the only, oh, look, I can see so clearly through these night vision goggles. And then you think, that's the only way I can look at this field, is through night vision goggles. Now, it is a way of looking, but it's limiting. Everything looks green, and everything looks strange, and things are lighter and darker than they would be. Another way of looking at the poet could come stand right next to you and say, even though everything's dark, they see the stars, and they start speaking about poetically. And they're seeing things just as real and just as true, but they're looking at it in a different way. And the poet would say, I'm seeing things totally differently. You could take someone who's blind, and they stand out in that field, but they see through their auditory senses, and they may experience that field in a different way than you do. And so the modern materialistic way of things is limiting, and it stems back to that fundamental limitation of Descartes, where he said the only truth that must be true is clear, concise ideas. Anything else can't be true, or is too vague for us to really be true or base things on. And that is an assumption and not a way of a scientific proof. And it's masquerading as a scientific proof. As soon as someone says science is the only way we can know things, you're saying, well, that's a philosophical statement, not a scientific statement. Therefore, it can't be true in your mindset. And therefore, at some point you have to do philosophy. And that's bad philosophy to limit things in that way. So yeah, that's the fundamental flaw, is limiting things in that way.
What makes that a philosophical statement to say that?
Well, just think about it. It's not a scientific, rational statement. At some point, you're saying, why am I measuring this? Why am I, okay, so you say, science is the only way of knowing things. And you say, well, why do you say that? Well, because, look, it's so effective. Well, who said that effectiveness is the measure of truth, right? At some point, you're doing some philosophy in there to determine things. There's always a fundamental assumption or foundation that we start our working off of. Nothing is, you start from clear, self-evident principles, yeah, but at some point, you're making assumptions. And those assumptions, they work in certain ways, but we can see in the world around us that they're clearly limited. And they're limited in many ways. It's like someone who is holding a hammer, to someone who's holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's true about this. To someone who has a rationalistic mindset, everything looks like it can fit into my rationalistic scheme. But the fundamental flaw is there at the very beginning. And that's why all these philosophical schools that I kind of talk through, they usually end up in some sort of will to power or pure emotivism in one way or another. So Nietzsche and Nazism is a product of all this, right? If nothing is true outside of me, then the only thing that can be true is my own will to power and my own, like the Superman in that way. Like the strong-hearted man has to just dominate the world around him because there's no external constraints, and the only thing that matters is that. And then that's where Nazism comes from, right? Who are you to stop me? Well, we're the superior race. We do these things this way. Or you look at postmodernism. We can't know anything rationally, therefore we give up, and the only thing that matters is our feelings. And so you have to express things feeling-wise. There's no order in art. Like, art can't have order because order doesn't exist. Only thing that matters is my feelings. So I can splash whatever I want on the canvas and call that art. And I have to deconstruct everything that I have. Or, the modern fascination is with identity. The only thing that matters is how I feel about myself. And how I feel about myself is how I should look at everything else around me, including art or literature or science or anything like that. All those reject the fundamental reality of the world around us, that there is something objective and real. Have you ever heard of Kant's phrases, the noumena and the phenomena? The only thing we can see is the phenomena. We can't know things in and of themselves. And because he's got this radical doubt of Descartes still stuck in his head. And because of that, we're not able to know things in and of themselves. If we can't know things in and of themselves, that excuse me, how can we know anything? Yep.
This might be like totally off track, but like, how do you even end up with that way of looking at the world being the predominant one?
Well, ideas have consequences, and they're tricky things. So maybe the average person, moral relativism is a great example of this. Moral relativism comes about from this way of looking at the world, right? Like, all that really matters is what's true to me, it can be false for you. For an average person who's like a farmer somewhere, they don't think in that way. But ideas seep into the culture. First, they're just the elite, and then they seep out. So that we've kind of fundamentally been raised in this through popular culture, through all these different things. And it's the air we breathe now. But it didn't start that way. But like that farmer, the perfect example, answer to moral relativism is like, if Patrick were to say, what's good for you is not good for me, I could just go up and punch him in the face. And then, well, it's good for me, okay, there's clearly something that's not morally relative. And G.K. Chesterton, I keep going back to him, but he wrote a book called Man Alive, in which all these dour professors were confronted by this guy who would try and shoot them, but just close enough so that it would shock them out of their malaise and help them to see that there is goodness in life and life is worth living. Sometimes common sense is what we need more of. But because we've been raised in this environment in which you've been told from childhood, just follow your feelings, and that's the only thing that really can guide you, or what do you feel about this? What do you feel about that? Everyone says that to me all the time. Well, I feel this. I'm like, I don't care what you feel. What do you think? There's a lack of understanding, and so it seeps into everything that we do. And because of that, it's super depressing. Because if nothing really exists outside of yourself, then you can't really have a real relationship with anyone. If nothing really exists except your feelings, that's a really dissatisfying way of looking at the world. And everyone you encounter is just a place for you to project your feelings on instead of someone you can actually receive as objective and part of, someone real. It doesn't necessarily explicitly shape our thought, but implicitly it's the air we breathe. And we need to be kind of freed from it. You're going to think about it in marriage. Marriage becomes romanticism, right? It starts in the 14th century, right around the time of Descartes, where marriage is primarily about this kind of romantic sense as opposed to an objective union and an objective institution with a partnership. It's all around us. This is the fundamental flaw in not in the United States, in the world. And it comes from not just Descartes, it comes from before him, from William of Ockham, who really started breaking down the foundations of thought, but that's another rant for another time. But it's good for us to know, why do I think the way I do? Well, because I've been swimming in this environment, which has finally, from Descartes' time, seeped down to me. And I have to start looking okay, this isn't the only way to do things. Other questions? Easy.
So why is our view not limited? Is it because we're looking at the final?
It's because we're looking at, we are open to other sources of knowledge and truth. Our understanding of what truth is more expansive. And for
So
us,
there is no one.
it's not clear, like limited as clear and concise ideas are. If you think about it, the things that are most important in your life really are not clear and concise. You know, love is a very difficult thing to have a clear and concise idea of. It's something that's ethereal and poetic and beyond us in a lot of ways. The most important things tend to be less certain in that way. And that can be hard for us if we've been raised in this mindset of like knowing clear and concisely things. But we can have, we can have a reality. We understand that reality is broader than that. We don't limit ourselves. This is fun. What I'm articulating is what philosophers fundamentally call Aristotelian or Thomistic realism. Things really are. They really do exist. They aren't just limited by matter or by like what we can see, but that there's depth to those things. And we can come to that, as we did, like when we talked about the existence of God at the very first class, we can come to that knowledge in a reasonable, rational way. I'm not saying we throw out reason, but we apply our reason in a different way. We start on different foundations. And that's why that line from Chesterton, to be, that is the answer. As soon as you start doubting your being or the being of things around you, then that's where you go off the rails. And so you gotta start with the assumption, the fundamental assumption, no, things really are. I can know truth about them, and that truth really does enter into me in a profound way, instead of it just being my application of myself to the world. That there's something objective outside of me, and that objective thing outside of me corresponds to the thoughts that are in my mind. And that's how I know what truth is. Other questions?
But then wasn't the fundamental flaw, couldn't it have been present since essentially the beginning, other than, I guess, the Garden of Eden?
Oh yeah, definitely. Just so happens that, like, we got into this problem. it is fundamental. Like, I mean, there's a fundamental flaw in human nature that we don't know things truly, but over time had been built up this Greek and Christian view of the world, which is based on philosophical realism, and which you can see other strains of thought in Greek thought. You look at Heraclitus, and he says everything is just change and transition. That prevents us from actually understanding the world as it is. Aristotle got a lot of stuff right. Plato got a lot of stuff right, and then we built on those shoulders, and that's why, like, I forgot who said it. It's some philosopher from the 12th century said, like, we're but dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants, and there's this understanding of like growing in this tradition of the outside world, and that tradition is basically the pinnacle of which is St. Thomas Aquinas' thought. And then right after that came Duns Scotus and then William of Ockham, who kind of started the process of its decay. And we basically haven't been able to get out of the hole that they've dug for this whole time. So it could have happened in different ways, and it does in different places. Different cultures have this. I'm talking mainly about the Western way of looking at the world. But any other questions? Faith and reason, the two go together. The two go together. Faith is one lens that we use to look at the world. It does not contradict reason. It's not me just closing my eyes to the world, but it's something deeper than that, which is it shapes the way I encounter things. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is just actually no, I kind of touched on everything. I just want to go back to the question of, and I touched on this briefly, why does God create a multitude of things? Like, how do we get between the one and the many? And we talked about this in God's knowledge, in God's will. But this was a hard problem for ancient philosophers, especially the Neoplatonists. Neoplatonists was a school of thought that followed Plato, obviously, after his time. Aristotle, unfortunately, his school didn't catch on as much. Plato was much more attractive. And so they had this question, like, okay, if there's one perfect form, the form of the good, they say, if there's one perfect form, why would there be a multitude of things? Why would he make a multitude of imperfect things? How would those imperfect things come to being? And St. Thomas answers this question by saying, one, it's willed. God creates all things purposely for their own good in order to share his gift of being. But then God also does so in a way that reflects himself back. So there's the diversity in creation is not the product of random chance, and it's not the product of imperfection. As if God, messed up when he created the platypus, or the platypodes, as Father Fish appropriately told us is the plural of platypus. God didn't mess up there. It wasn't like, oh, that was weird. Like I should have done a little bit better when I was making those otters. It ended up with the duck mouth got in the wrong part of the machine. No, everything is willed by God in its creation. And we saw this. Everything is willed insofar as he gives the gift of being. And he gives them their form. And that diversity reflects back more perfectly his goodness than a lack of diversity would. Because his goodness, his infinite goodness, cannot be reflected back by one created thing. Because created things are in their nature imperfect and limited, only thing that can really reflect back God's goodness and glory in some way is the creation of a multitude of things. All those things reflect back some facet of God's creation. And you don't have to think of it just in terms of species. Think about it in terms of yourself. You guys are all weird. You all have your own uniqueness. You all have aspects about you which are different from others. Dora Marie's hair and Patrick's hair are very different. And they both reflect back the glory of God in different ways, in some cases. Vinny's hair reflects the glory of God in a very different way. It's hard to see sometimes, but it reflects back the glory of God in a different way. Each one of you is made good by him. Because remember, we talked about how being and good are convertible. And so the fact that you exist is the definition of your goodness. We talked about this before. But that goodness is deliberately willed. He thought, I'm making a quasar, I'm making a brown dwarf star, I'm making, mountains in the Himalayas, and I'm making you with all your particularities. Now, we deface, in a certain way, his creation. We'll talk about that next semester when we talk about sin. But fundamentally, everything is made good and willed for themselves and willed to reflect back his goodness in some particular facet. There is something about you that reflects the goodness of God that no one else and nothing else can reflect back, even if you have a twin. Nothing else can reflect back that goodness like your uniqueness. And it's all part of the multifaceted plan of giving God glory. And so, understanding that you are willed into being, you are willed good, you are known from eternity, you are known in your form from all eternity, and you have a goal, a final end. It's fundamentally built into you since you're a creature. That's something that we need to reflect on, and hold on to, because the fundamentally, this thing we've been talking about, the materialist view of looking at the world. What does it say? It says you are not willed. You're the product of random chance. There's nothing really that defines who you are, besides your own experience, and you have no goal or end. You're totally open-ended, which leaves you adrift in this massive world that no one cares about you and no one knows you. That's a very different way of looking at the world. And it's based on bad philosophy and bad fundamental assumptions. And so, what we're going to do now is going to look into the particulars of God's creation, and especially the most glorious parts of God's creation, which are the angels, which we'll talk about next time, and then the mankind. With that, I'm in the process of ordering stickers. If you have classes that you need to catch up on, you can. I will take your word for it if you check it off that you watched the class, but don't lie to me about this in order to get a sticker. That's stupid. But remember, the goal is to watch 80% of the classes, so you don't have to watch all of them. But if you missed one and you want to catch up, the website that Vinny's been very gracious is there. And I told you guys before, but I'll say it again. I do want to do a one-page final paper where you just reflect briefly on one aspect of God that you've learned about, and how that's affected your spiritual life in some way. It could be very simple, it could be very elaborate, whatever it is, but that will be due to me by the last class, I guess we'll say. I don't remember if we have class next week or not. I think we might, but then we won't the week after that, and then we have 2 more classes and then we're done. So there's 3 classes left, I know that much. And then this class will continue next semester. I'm working on that. I've got a guest lecturer lined up for next semester for one part of it. But we're going to talk about the Prima Secundae, which is, I mean, all this stuff, this is all, you know, Father Thomas Joseph, this is these dogma guys. I'm a moral theologian, and so we're getting into my wheelhouse next semester, which is that's my favorite stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. So, yeah, Vinny.
Is there a sticker for next semester?
Yes, there will be a different sticker for next semester, so you have to collect them all. Is the goal. So, good? Okay, like usual, I'll stick around for questions if you have questions. No, the earth is not flat, Mark.